There is a kind of silence that is not empty. It is the silence that lives inside very old walls. Walls built not merely to stand, but to sing. Walls whose architects understood that stone, when shaped with sufficient precision and set upon the correct meridian lines of the earth, becomes a tuning fork, becomes a mouth, becomes a memory. The world you are about to enter is old in the way that deep water is old. Not aged, not decayed, simply prior. Prior to everything you have been told was the beginning. Prior to the first word of the first story that the new world told itself about what was real and what was permitted and what a human being was allowed, in the quiet of their own body, to become. It is called Selvundra, and in Selvundra, the cathedrals breathe. Not as metaphor. The architects of Selvundra did not build in metaphor. They built in truth, which is a more demanding material, and they understood that breath is not merely the movement of air through a body, but the movement of the sacred through whatever vessel is prepared to receive it. The cathedrals breathed because they had been built to breathe, oriented to the deep currents of the earth's own respiration. Their stones carved so that the wind passing through the high passages was not merely wind but instruction, not merely sound but initiation, not merely air but the living medium through which the oldest knowledge traveled between those who held it and those who were ready to receive it. In Selvundra, a building was not a shelter. A building was a teacher. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders, from your jaw, from the long-held tension of the hands. Breathe slowly. There is something beneath the ordinary world, beneath the familiar weight of things, beneath the surface of what you have been told is solid and permanent and done. Something that has never stopped moving, never stopped transmitting, never stopped its ancient patient work of reaching upward through stone and root and bone toward whatever in you is still listening. Somewhere very far below the surface of what you know, a bell is ringing. It has always been ringing. It is ringing now. And listen, just for a moment, just in the soft space at the edge of the breath, you can almost hear it. The man who walked through sacred fog. The fog that covered the lower precincts of Vale Ostrom was not natural fog. Tartarian had known this for 3 years, though he had known it the way you know things you are not yet ready to act upon. In the body, below the level of the professional mind, in the place where truth settles when it cannot find a door. Natural fog tasted of salt and cold iron and the breath of rivers. It settled on the skin with the mild curiosity of a thing that had no agenda. This fog was different. It tasted of calcite and ancient copper and something almost sweet beneath those. Like amber resin. Like pine sap left to crystallize across centuries in the dark interior of stone. It moved with a slight luminescence in the deeper passages, barely perceptible. The way certain creatures of the deep ocean carry their own cold and purposeful light through the absolute dark of the water's floor. This was the sacred fog of Selvundra's underworld. In the oldest accounts, the ones that predated the suppression, the ones that Tartarian had read in the restricted archive with the particular hunger of a man who does not yet know what he is hungry for, the fog was called the Vale of Ethmuin, and it was described not as a meteorological phenomenon but as a spiritual one. The visible breath of the earth's deepest channel, rising through the stone layers of the city the way incense rises through a temple, carrying in its particles the dissolved memory of everything Selvundra had been before the suppression came and the mudfloods came and the spires were buried and the new city was built on top of the old one the way fear builds itself on top of wonder and calls itself progress. This was Tartarian's 7th descent into the lower precincts in as many months. He was tall, narrow in the shoulder, dressed in the long gray coat of the suppressive order, its buttons of black obsidian, its cut unchanged across 3 centuries, because the order maintained its appearance with the same consistency that it maintained everything. As a statement of permanence, of authority so deep-rooted it required no update, no acknowledgement of time's passage. He wore no hat. His hair was the color of wet ash, cut with a severity that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the removal of anything that could be taken hold of. His face was not unkind. This had always been his most precise instrument. He carried, in the inner breast pocket of his coat, a document on a material the Upper City Archives listed only as substrate of origin, a membrane grown rather than manufactured, pressed from a substance that the suppressive order's own scholars had never successfully replicated, that the restricted archive described as pre-suppression alchemical vellum, properties unknown, manufactured discontinued. The document bore the order's seal, a circle enclosing a hand enclosing an eye. Beneath the seal, the order's motto in the old sacred tongue, Quod non sitter, non nocet, what is not known cannot harm. Or, and this was the translation that had begun to trouble Tartarian's sleep, arriving in the early hours of the morning with the particular clarity of things the mind can only receive when the professional self has temporarily released its grip. What is not known does not exist. He had spent 23 years serving a philosophy of non-existence. He was beginning to wonder what this said about him. The mission was as they always were, simple in its statement, complex in its implications. There was a presence in the lower precincts drawing pilgrims. Not dozens, hundreds now, arriving from the middle city and from far beyond it, thin and luminous-eyed, their bodies already changed by the walk toward something they could not name, asking in the sacred fog of Vale Ostrom for the Magi. Pilgrims were not the problem. The order had always known how to manage individuals. What the order could not manage, what, in the deepest and most restricted layers of the archive, the order's own scholars had documented as an unsolvable problem, was what happened to a human body when it came within proximity of the lower precincts and stayed. The body changed, not dramatically, not in ways that could be pointed to and categorized and suppressed, but the body changed, in the quiet territory of what the Selvundran tradition called the alchemical interior, the invisible but perfectly real process by which the soul, given the right conditions, begins the long work of transforming the material of its own nature, turning the lead of sleep and forgetting into the gold of wakefulness and remembrance. The order could not suppress an alchemical process. You cannot arrest dawn. Tartarian walked slowly, as he always walked in the lower precincts. The buildings on either side of the passage rose 5, 6, 7 stories, their faces carved in what the order's official cultural assessments called decorative relief of religious significance, characteristic of pre-rational civilizations. Tartarian had believed this once. He had not believed it for some time. The carvings were not decorative. They were functional in the most precise and sophisticated sense of the word. Each groove, each channel, each protruding geometric form, each spiraling glyph that ran from the foundation stones to the highest cornices. All of it was acoustic engineering of a kind that the order's own scholars had spent a century attempting to reverse engineer and failed, because the engineering was not purely acoustic and could not be understood by an intelligence that refused to acknowledge the nature of what it was designed to transmit. The carvings were a language, not a language of words, a language of resonance, of the sacred frequency that moved through the earth beneath Vale Ostrom, that Bel Soreth was built to receive and amplify and express, that the fog of the Vale of Ethmuin carried in its luminescent particles. A language that spoke not to the mind but to the body's own alchemical interior, bypassing every layer of suppression and professional conditioning and 23 years of careful training in the art of not hearing what the body was hearing. He had understood this for about 3 years. He had told no one. He turned a corner and stopped. Ahead of him, perhaps 40 meters down the passage, in the sacred fog, something was sitting. At first, for just a moment, the fraction of time before professional perception reasserted itself, he thought it was a building. The scale insisted on it. But then the thing shifted, the slow glacial repositioning of something enormously, anciently heavy, and he understood that what he was looking at was not a building. It was a man, seated with its back against the wall of what had once been, according to the sacred cartography of the old Selvundran order, the true order, the one that had been suppressed along with everything else, a primary resonance node of the great frequency network of Selvundra. Seated with its knees drawn up, each knee the approximate dimensions of a door. Seated with its great head bowed, so that the long pale hair fell forward and lay on the fog-covered stones like rivers of old light. The giant, Tartarian, stopped breathing. He was a professional. He had been a professional for 23 years. He placed one hand flat against the carved wall beside him. A professional gesture of steadying, of physical orientation in conditions of limited visibility, not anything else, not the unconscious reaching of a body toward the transmission it had been starved of for 23 years of professional distance. And he felt the wall. The wall was alive, not in a way that could be categorized, not in any way the Order's lexicon had words for. Alive in the way that only things that have been built from a deep and sacred understanding of what aliveness is can be alive. Not with the biological warmth of a body, but with something older than biology, with the cool and continuous and immeasurable vitality of a thing that has been singing the same perfect note since before the first human being learned to hear it, and will be singing it after the last one stops listening. He had read the Order's files on the giant. Anomalous subject. Pre-suppression lineage. Extreme height 11 to 13 feet when standing. Considered docile. Non-threatening to Order interests provided associations were managed. The files had not told him about the quality of the stillness. Because the giant was not merely sitting. The giant was transmuting. This was the word that arrived in Tartarian's mind and refused to be replaced by anything more professional. The giant was transmuting, performing in its great body the fundamental alchemical operation of Selvundra. The reception of the sacred frequency from the deep earth, the holding of it in the vessel of the self, the slow and patient work of letting it do what it was designed to do, which was to change whatever it moved through into something more truly itself. More golden, more awake, head bowed, great hands resting open on its knees, palms upward and open in the ancient posture of sacred receptivity. The posture carved into the meditation figures of the Selvundran temples, the posture depicted at the center of every alchemical diagram in the restricted archive's oldest and most carefully hidden documents, and in the deep sacred silence of the Vale of Ethmuin, it was receiving. And after a moment of perfect stillness, his own palm still flat against the singing wall, Tartarian became aware that he could feel it too. Not here. Feel. In the palm. In the bones. Rising through the carved stone like warmth through the floor above a deep fire. Like the movement of water through rock that has learned, over centuries, to make space for it. A tone. A single, sustained, immeasurable tone. He pressed his palm harder against the wall. The vibration deepened. And for a moment, just a moment, but a moment complete in itself, sufficient, the kind of moment that does not require repetition because it contains everything, he felt what the giant felt. The tone moved through the stone and through his palm and through his bones and into the tightly wound architecture of his chest. And something in that architecture, something he had been told was not there, had trained himself to believe was not there, had built 23 years of professional behavior around the absence of, began very slightly to loosen. The alchemical process. First contact. Then the moment passed. And Tartarian straightened his coat and made a note in his professional ledger in his professional hand and moved silently back into the sacred fog the way he had come. He did not file a report on the giant that night. He told himself it was because the mission was not yet complete. He did not examine what else it might be. Hashtag chapter 2. The giant whose name was Orin. His name was Orin. He had not always been called this. He had once had a name in the sacred language of Selvundra, a name that was also a frequency, that was also a set of cosmological coordinates, that was also a description of a quality of light that exists only in the moment before dawn when the sky is neither dark nor light but is the third thing, the thing between, the liminal radiance that the Selvundran mystics called the light of becoming. But that name required a resonant chamber to pronounce correctly, and there were very few resonant chambers left now in the surface world, and so he had accepted the shorter name that the lower precinct people had given him, because it was given with love, and Orin valued love above all other things. Above age, above wisdom, above the vast accumulated understanding of 4 centuries of conscious existence. Love was the frequency beneath all frequencies. Love was what Bel-Soreth was ultimately transmitting in all its tones. He was, by the reckoning of those who had tried to reckon him, somewhere between 400 and 900 years old. He himself was not certain. Time, for Orin, was not the sequential thing the new world had decided it must be. Not the beads on the string, one following another, orderly, accountable, each moment replaced by the next. Time for Orin was more like what the alchemical texts called the aurum of duration. Not a line but a substance, not a progression but a quality, something you moved through not forward but in spirals, always returning to temperatures you recognized, always finding in the newest moment the resonance of the most ancient one, because all moments were made of the same material and that material did not age. He had tried, once, to explain this to a woman named Sephra, who brought him bread on the cold evenings of the Vale months. He had said, "Imagine that time is not a road but an ocean, and you do not walk along it but float in it, and the water that holds you now is the same water that has always held you, and what you call the past and what you call the present are not different places but different temperatures of the same depth." Sephra had held her bread for a long time, thinking about this, and then said, "That sounds like being everywhere at once." Yes, Orin had said. Exactly like that. He had come to Vale Ostrom, specifically to the lower precincts, specifically to this relay node wall for the bells. He had come the way the salmon comes to the river of its origin. Not because it has decided to, not because it has consulted a map, but because something in the deepest architecture of its being recognizes the water and the water recognizes it, and the returning is simply the completion of a pattern that was always going to complete. The bells of Selvundra called him. Not loudly. They had never, even in the age of their full power, operated at the level of noise. The sacred frequency of Bel-Soreth was precisely the opposite of noise. It was the frequency below all noise, the tone beneath the surface of all the surfaces of the world, what the alchemists called the prima vox, the first voice, the voice that had spoken the world into existence and had never stopped speaking, could never stop speaking because the world's continued existence depended on it. Orin could hear it from very far away, further than any living human, and further still than that. He had been hearing it for 4 centuries. Through the long years of the suppression, through the mud floods and the forced forgetting and the systematic dismantling of everything the Order considered dangerous, which was, in the end, everything that was true, he had heard it. He sat in the sacred fog of the Vale and received it. And in the lower precincts of Vale Ostrom, in the fog that tasted of ancient copper and crystallized amber and the deep breath of the living earth, the people who lived their humble lives in the shadow of the old carvings left bread for him on cold evenings, and he thanked them, and they were changed by his thanks in ways they could not articulate but carried in their bodies for the rest of their lives. On the evening that Tartarian had pressed his palm to the wall and felt the tone and had something loosen in his chest, on that same sacred evening, Orin raised his great head from its bowed position and looked at the place in the fog where the man in the gray coat had stood. He could feel the imprint of him, the contact point where a human hand had touched the wall and the wall had touched back. The exchange of the alchemical first kiss between a sleeping soul and the sacred frequency it had been sleeping away from for 23 years. He could feel it in the stone the way you feel the warmth of a hand that has only just lifted from your own. He bowed his head again. He smiled, not because anything had been accomplished, Nothing in the Selvundran understanding was accomplished quickly. The first contact was not an accomplishment. It was a seed, and seeds did not require celebration. They required patience and dark, and the continuing presence of the frequency in the earth beneath them, doing its slow and sacred work. He settled deeper into his meditation. The veil moved around him. Below him, through the stones and the layers of buried Selvundra and the resonite shell of the great cathedral. Below all of it, in the fundament, in the deep sacred dark, Bel Soreth rang on. First contact, it rang. The work begins. ## Chapter 3. The Deep Spiritual Magi. She lived 3 levels below the lowest street. Not as exile, not as hiding, though certain forces would have preferred her hidden, preferred her silent, preferred her in the kind of deep non-existence that the suppressive order maintained for things it found most threatening. She lived below the lowest street because below was the direction of depth, and depth was the direction of truth, and she was a woman who had followed truth downward her entire life and had found each time that the going down was not a descent but an initiation, that the darkness below was not the absence of light but the form light takes when it is most concentrated, most essential, most purely itself. She was Magi Savine. The lower precincts people called her simply the Magi, which in the sacred tongue of Selvundra meant not merely wise one but something more precise and more difficult. One who has completed the first 3 operations and survived the 4th. In the alchemical tradition of Selvundra, there were 7 sacred operations, 7 transformations of the interior substance of the self, corresponding to the 7 tones of Bel Soreth, corresponding to the 7 levels of the city's buried sacred. Architecture, corresponding to the 7 metals of the old alchemical system that the upper city now taught as a quaint pre-scientific curiosity rather than what it actually was, which was the most accurate map of the human soul ever produced by any civilization on the surface of the earth. The operations were calcinatio, solutio, coagulatio, sublimatio, mortificatio, separatio, coniunctio, burning, dissolving, solidifying, rising, dying, separating, unifying. Savine had completed all 7. This was not a common thing. The restricted archive of the suppressive order listed, across the entire known history of Selvundra, 43 individuals who had completed the full sequence of operations. The order called them by their threat designation, Adepti. In the sacred tradition they were called by their true name, the completed. And what completion meant, what it actually, physically, spiritually meant to stand on the other side of all 7 operations, was something that the order scholars had spent generations trying to understand and had failed, because you cannot understand the completed from outside the process any more than you can understand what water feels like from a desert. Magi Savine had completed the 7th operation 40 years ago. She had been, ever since, doing what the completed do, holding space, holding the sacred frequency in its most refined and concentrated form, holding the tradition, holding the question that was not one question but the doorway through which all questions entered the territory where they could actually be answered. She was not what the pilgrims expected. The pilgrims expected someone ancient in the theatrical sense. Robes heavy with symbol, a voice made of deep caves, a presence that declared itself. They expected the performance of the sacred, which the upper city had taught them to mistake for the sacred itself. Magi Savine was small and moved quickly and had a way of speaking that stripped every sentence to its exact necessary weight. No more and no less, the way the alchemical calcinatio, the sacred burning, the first operation, strips the soul of everything accumulated and unnecessary until only what is irreducible remains. She offered each pilgrim a chair. She offered silence. And then she offered the question. It was always the same question. She had given it perhaps 10,000 times in her long years below the lowest street. She had given it to merchants and mystics, to the broken and the arrogant, to those who had walked for days to reach her and those who had stumbled in by accident, to the rare operative of the suppressive order who had found her not by tracking and filing but by following something that rose in their chest when they pressed their hand against the right wall at the right moment and could not, after that, be unfollowed. The question was, what did you come here knowing that you did not know you knew? It was not a comfortable question. It was an alchemical one, a calcinatio question, a burning question, designed to remove the comfortable and familiar armor of what a person thought they were seeking and reveal beneath it what they had actually carried all along. The knowledge that preceded seeking, the wisdom that was already present before the journey began, that was, in truth, the reason the journey had been necessary at all. And in the sacred resonance of the sublevels, in the deep harmonics of Bel Soreth rising through the stones, people answered. Slowly, with great surprise, with the specific quality of amazement that belongs to those who discover that the treasure was in the chest they had been sitting on throughout the long and arduous search for it. On the evening that Tartaria's palm had made its first contact with the relay node wall, on that same evening, as it happened, Magi Savine was in conversation with Orin. Not in person. Orin's presence in the sublevels was a matter of voice and resonance and the acoustic channels of the old network, channels that, in the Selvundran tradition, were understood not as mere tubes for sound but as veins of the sacred body of the city, carrying the frequency the way the blood carries the vitality of the living organism. He pressed his mouth to the relay node above, and his voice descended through the stone, and arrived in Savine's chamber with a warmth and nearness that the physical distance made technically impossible, which was, in the tradition of Selvundra, considered neither remarkable nor paradoxical but simply the natural behavior of things operating correctly. "He came again tonight," Orin's voice said. It arrived from somewhere in the south wall, resonant and unhurried, like a tide rather than a sound. Savine did not look up from her work. On the table before her lay the inscription membrane, the primary text of the Selvundran sacred tradition, which she had spent 40 years reconstructing from fragments and ruins and the somatic memories of pilgrims and the deep reading of the city's alchemical architecture itself. The membrane did not merely contain the tradition. The membrane was the tradition, grown rather than written, the text arising from its own material the way roots arise from the earth, carrying in its very substance the frequency of what it recorded. "Which one?" she said. "The gray coat," Orin said. "The one who carries the order's seal but does not belong to the order's frequency. He has never belonged to it. He wears the coat the way a child wears a parent's coat. Taken up, not grown into." Savine set down her instrument. She considered this. "He touched the wall tonight," Orin said. The contact was clear. The node responded. She looked up. The luminescence of the sublevels, the soft, self-generated light of stone that has been saturated with sacred frequency for centuries, made her face calm and very alert, both at once. "First calcinatio contact," she said. "Yes. How long has he been circling?" 7 months, Orin said. 7 descents. The sacred number of the operations in the number of the months. Savine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The cathedral knows." "The cathedral has known from before he was born," Orin said gently. "It knows us all before we know ourselves. That is its nature. That is why the old builders built it." The sacred tone moved through the stones around her. "Will he come?" she said. "He is already coming," Orin said. "He has been coming since the first descent. The gray coat is the last skin of a man who has been shedding skins for 7 months in the sacred fog of the veil. When he arrives, he will arrive without it." Savine pressed her palm to the table. The inscription membrane shimmered faintly under her touch, responsive, the way living things respond to the warmth of other living things. "The bell is louder tonight," she said. "Yes," Orin said. "It is calling." She returned to her work. The bell called. In the sacred fog of the Vale of Ethmuin above, the carved walls sang their ancient acoustic language into the dark. And in the stones of Vale Ostrom, in the foundations and the relay nodes and the carved channels and the deep resonite shell of Belsoreth, the alchemical work of the city continued its patient and eternal labor. Calcinatio, solutio, coagulatio, burning, dissolving, solidifying, the first three operations. Already, in the chest of a man in a gray coat moving silently through the veil, the burning had begun. Chapter 4 Belsoreth, the cathedral that is alive. It is necessary, before we go further, to speak of the cathedral. Not of what it looked like. The record of its appearance in the outer world has been deliberately confused and misdirected, and in any case the outer appearance of a sacred alchemical structure is, in the Selvundran tradition, considered its least significant attribute, the way the face of a person is their least significant attribute to someone who loves them. It is necessary to speak of what the cathedral is, in the deepest and most precise sense of is, the sense that means not merely existence but active, purposive, living being. Belsoreth is alive. This is not metaphor. The architects of Selvundra, the ones whose names are carved into the foundation stones of the lower precincts in a script that the suppressive order has spent 2 centuries cataloging and has never successfully decoded, because decoding it requires receiving it rather than analyzing it. Those architects understood something that the New World science of building has systematically unlearned, that a structure built with sufficient sacred intention, aligned to the correct telluric currents of the earth, constructed from materials chosen for their alchemical properties rather than merely their load-bearing capacity, oriented to the magnetic and astronomical principles that the Selvundran tradition called the 7 alignments of the living world. Such a structure does not merely contain space. It breathes into it. Belsoreth was the greatest living structure in the history of Selvundra. It had been grown, not built, grown. The Selvundran texts are consistent on this distinction. The way a garden is grown rather than assembled, through the collaboration of human sacred intention and the earth's own generative intelligence, over a period of decades at a specific location in the cartography of Vale Ostrom. A location where 7 underground sacred water channels converged, where the telluric current of the earth made a spiral rather than a line, where the crystalline substrate of the bedrock was of a composition that the old alchemists called prima materia, the first matter, the original substance that underlies all other substances and from which all transformation ultimately proceeds. The cathedral had 7 spires. Each spire was a tone. The 7 tones sounded together as they had sounded together in the age before the suppression, when the spires stood at their full height and the frequency network of Selvundra was alive and the sacred fog of the Vale carried the combined chord of Belsoreth into every street and passage and chamber of the lower precincts, formed what the Selvundran alchemical tradition called the chord of the completed self. The chord that, when received by the human body in conditions of sufficient openness, initiated the first alchemical operation, calcinatio, the sacred burning, the beginning of the 7 transformations that would, if followed to their completion, produce in a human being what the old tradition called the philosopher's gold. Not a metal, never a metal in the literal sense, but the transmuted substance of the self. The self that has been burned and dissolved and reformed and raised and died and separated and finally unified with its own deepest nature, with the frequency that the earth itself expresses, with the tone that Belsoreth has been singing since before the first human being stood within its walls. And at the center of Belsoreth, in the great spherical chamber beneath the primary dome, a chamber built from resonite and crystal and prima materia and the specific geometric proportions that the sacred tradition called the ratios of the living soul, there was the bell itself. Not a bell in the sense the outer world uses. Not metal and rope and the simple physics of impact. The bell of Soreth was a void, a precisely engineered, geometrically sacred emptiness at the heart of the cathedral, the Selvundran tradition's great paradox and its deepest teaching. The most powerful thing is the most empty thing. The vessel that holds the most is the vessel that contains nothing. The tone that moves the world is the tone that arises from silence, from the creative void, from the prima materia in its most essential state, before any form, before any name, before any story. The void rang, had always rung, without mechanism, without maintenance, without anyone to sustain it, because it sustained itself, because an emptiness that is aligned to the sacred frequency of the earth requires nothing but the continued existence of the earth to continue its singing. It rang because the earth turned and in its turning sang, and Bel Soreth had been built to be the ear and the voice of that singing simultaneously. The suppressive order had tried to silence it. In the early years of the suppression they had tried everything. Flooding, physical excavation, the construction of counter-resonance devices that the Order's engineers had spent decades developing. Instruments that broadcast precise counter-frequencies intended to cancel the bell's tone the way darkness cancels light. But you cannot cancel the tone that arises from the void. You can introduce noise. The Order had introduced considerable noise. But noise and silence are not opposites. They are different orders of thing entirely, and silence always outlasts noise, because silence requires nothing to sustain it and noise requires everything. The bell rang on, and the Order had done the only thing remaining. They buried it. Not merely physically, though the managed inundation of the lower precincts, which the Order's public records described as flood mitigation infrastructure, had done considerable work toward that, but cognitively. Culturally, architecturally, they built on top. They renamed. They produced the new histories and the new educational texts and the new artistic tradition that depicted the carvings of the lower precincts as the quaint and superstitious productions of a pre-rational people who had not yet learned to separate science from myth, structure from symbol, building from belief. But Bel Soreth did not require belief. Bel Soreth required only proximity, and the sacred fog of the Vale of Ethmuin moved through Vale Ostrom every night, carrying the frequency into every space it entered, into the lungs and the blood and the alchemical interior of every being it touched. And in the stones of the relay nodes the tone traveled without ceasing, the way the memory of water travels through rock that was once a riverbed. And in the deep fundament below the cathedral, in the sacred dark below even Bel Soreth's resonite shell, beings of immense and patient power held the frequency in its most concentrated form, as they had held it through the entire duration of the suppression, waiting with the patience of things that understand that time is an ocean and that what is true is always ultimately rising. Agent Deterior had pressed his hand against one of these bones. He had felt the bell, and now, lying in his bed in the middle city above the Vale, in the clean and ordered room of a professional man who had built his life around the orderly management of what was permitted to be known. Lying in the dark with his palm warm and the warmth not fading the way warmth fades when its source is removed, but continuing, as if the source were inside his own hand now, as if the contact had deposited something in him that was continuing to work. He was lying awake, and he was asking himself a question. Not an order question. Not the kind of question 23 years of professional service had made him very skilled at asking. A different question. An older one. One that had been waiting in the place where the knot was, waiting for the knot to loosen enough that it could rise. What is it, the question said slowly in the private dark, that I am made of that has been trying all this time to sing? He lay there. He did not sleep. And far below him, through the city's layers, through the sacred fog and the relay nodes and the resonite shell of the void chamber, bell Soreth sang. Come down, it said. Asterisk, come down. Come down. Come down. Asterisk. Hashtag chapter 5. What did Tartarian found when he stopped looking? He went back 11 more times before he descended. 11 more evenings in the sacred fog, moving through the carved passages of the lower precincts with his hand returning, again and again, to the walls, the professional gesture of orientation. He told himself, the physical anchor in conditions of limited visibility. Not the reaching of a body toward the transmission it had been starved of for 23 years of professional distance. Not the beginning of what the Selvundran tradition called the Via Alchemica, the alchemical path, the way that opens when a soul has burned enough of its accumulated false material to feel, however briefly, the genuine warmth of what it actually is. Not that. On the fourth return visit, Oren raised his great head from its bowed meditation and looked at Tartarian from 40 meters through the fog. The amber eyes that held a quality Tartarian had no professional vocabulary for, a quality he thought of privately as geological depth, the depth of a canyon rather than a pond, the depth of something that went down further than looking could follow, found him without effort. Oren looked at him. The look was not a challenge, not an assessment. It was something closer to what the old sacred texts called recognition, the specific and profound quality of seeing someone not as they present themselves but as what they are beneath the presentation, the soul sight that the Selvundran tradition said was one of the earliest gifts that opened in those who had begun the alchemical work. Oren nodded, very slightly, then returned his great head to its bowed position and went back to the receiving that was his ancient and sacred vocation. On the 12th visit, Tartarian followed the frequency. He could not have said in advance that he would. He had made no decision. The professional mind which makes decisions was not involved. What was involved was something underneath the professional mind, something that had been getting underneath it, through the crack that the first contact had opened in the wall he had built between himself and himself for 11 months now. Something that followed the sacred tone the way water follows the shape of the ground it moves across. Not by decision, not by choice, but by the simple and inviolable fact of its own nature. The passage was there. Whether it had been there before, whether it was a passage he had simply not perceived on previous visits, or whether the city itself had made a way where there had been none, which was a thing the Selvundran tradition held to be entirely possible and the Order's tradition held to be nonsense. He could not say. It went down, into the older stone and the older stone and the oldest stone, the stone that preceded all the suppression's layers of rebuilding and renaming, the stone that was simply Selvundra prior, patient, waiting in the dark with its ancient carved face and its alchemical memory intact. The resonance grew as he descended. Not louder, more total. Moving into him not from one direction but from all of them simultaneously, filling the available space of his interior the way light fills a room when the curtains are finally drawn back. Not arriving because it had always been there, but becoming apparent, the difference being the curtains, the difference being the gray coat and the 23 years and the professional distance and the knot loosening with every step down through the sacred architecture of the city's own interior. By the time he found the chamber, the knot was so loose it was barely a knot at all. He found Savine. She did not look up when he entered. "Sit down," she said. He sat. The silence between them was long and resonant and not at all uncomfortable, which surprised him. He was not accustomed to silence that felt like nourishment. The Order's silences were strategic, the silence of withheld information, the silence of managed space. This silence was generous. It gave. "You have been coming to the lower precincts," Savine said, still not looking up. Her hands moved over the inscription membrane with the practiced ease of someone reading a language that lives in the fingertips as much as the eyes. "For 11 months, he said. "And you have not reported what you found." "No." "Why not?" He pressed both palms flat on the table. The resonance of Belsoreth moved through the stone and into his hands, and he felt, as he had been feeling with increasing clarity and decreasing ability to professionally categorize, the warmth, the depth at the center of the palm, the sense of a door. Because, he said, what I found was not what I had been sent to find, and what I had been sent to find, what the Order has always sent its operatives to find and suppress and file and forget, began, after sufficient time in the presence of the lower precincts, to seem less like a threat and more like the only true thing I had ever been close to. Savine set down her instrument. She looked at him, and he looked back, and he was aware in the looking that he was being seen, not observed, not assessed, not categorized and filed. Seen. In the alchemical sense, the soul sight. He felt it the way you feel sunlight on your face after a long winter, with the startled gratitude of a body that had forgotten it was cold. What did you come here knowing? She said. That you did not know you knew? The bell rang through the stones. An agent Tartarian, 23 years, gray coat, obsidian buttons, professional distance, the knot. Put both his hands flat on the sacred table of the deep spiritual magi, and the knot released entirely, and he opened his mouth and he answered. He talked for a long time. He talked about the carved walls and what they truly were. He talked about the veil of Ethmuin and its alchemical properties. He talked about the first contact with the relay node, and the warmth that had not faded, and the question that had been waiting in the place where the knot was. He talked about what he had gradually and against every professional instinct understood the lower precincts to be, not a district, not a problem to be managed, but a sacred body, the body of Selvundra, still alive, still breathing, still doing its ancient work of transformation on everything that came within its influence. He talked about what he was afraid he was becoming. Not afraid, Savine said gently when he reached that word. That is the Order's word for it. The Order calls the alchemical opening contamination, it calls the calcinatio destabilization, it calls the solutio the dissolving of the false self, which is the sacred second operation, it calls that compromise. The Order has a full vocabulary for the sacred process, and every word in it is wrong. What is the right vocabulary? He said. She placed her palm on the inscription membrane. Asterisk awakening, asterisk, she said simply. In the sacred tongue of Selvundra, there is one word for all 7 operations. One word for the entire alchemical journey from the first calcinatio to the final coniunctio, from the first burning to the last great unification. One word for what you are in the process of becoming. She told him the word. He did not repeat it aloud. The sacred tongue required a resonant chamber, but he held it in his chest where the knot had been, and it fit there the way the right key fits the right lock. Not forcing anything open, simply revealing that the opening had always been possible, that the door had always been a door, that he had simply been standing on the wrong side of it for 23 years, calling the door a wall. Belsoreth, he said. Yes, she said. It is not a building. No, she said. It is not a building. It is the alchemical vessel, the athanor, the sacred furnace, the structure within which the transformation of everything that enters it is the primary and only purpose. Every stone of it, every tone of it, the void at its center, the fog of the veil that it breathes into the city. All of it is the furnace, and the furnace is alive, and what it is burning, what it has always been burning, through the entire duration of the suppression, through all the flooding and the renaming and the filing away of what it is, what it has always been burning is the accumulated sleep of the world. The tone moved through the floor, through his feet, through his legs and spine and the loosened space in his chest where the knot had been. And the smoke of that burning, Savine said, with a very small and very warm and very old smile, is what they call the sacred fog. He looked at her. The veil of Ethmuin, he said, is the breath of the transformation, she said. Yes, the city's own calcinatio, its sacred burning, rising as smoke and fog and carrying in every particle the dissolved alchemical material of everything that has been transformed. This is why it changes those who breathe it. This is why pilgrims arrive different from when they left. This is why 11 months in its presence has loosened your knot and warmed your hands and brought you to this chair. The order has been breathing it too, he said slowly. Everyone in the upper city breathes the veil. Yes, she said. Then why? Because breathing is not enough, she said. Breathing is the beginning. The veil prepares the vessel, but the vessel must also choose to be prepared. The order has built its entire apparatus around the cultivation of a specific quality of resistance, a trained, professional, systematic refusal of the alchemical opening, maintained through habit and hierarchy and the deep, comfortable numbness of believing that what you suppress does not exist. She paused. You stopped resisting. That is all. That is everything. The bell rang in the fundament below. Deep, patient, perfect. Come down, it said. Asterisk, come down. Come down. Asterisk. And Tartarian, for the last time thinking of himself as Tartarian, as the agent, as the professional man in the gray coat, felt the warmth in his palms intensify and understood that he was not going anywhere. He was already here. He had been here since the first palm against the first wall. The calcinatio was complete. The second operation was beginning. Hashtag Chapter 6. The nature of the cathedral's sacred work. It is necessary here to speak plainly of what Belsoreth actually does. Not in the vocabulary of the suppressive order, whose language for sacred things is a language of threat and management. In the vocabulary of Selvundra itself, which is the vocabulary of transformation, of the 7 sacred operations, of the alchemical tradition that the order has spent 2 centuries calling primitive superstition while spending 2 centuries and considerable resources being unable to suppress the effects it describes. Belsoreth performs calcinatio on everything that enters its field. The field is the lower precincts. The field is the Vale of Ethmuin. The field, at a subtler level, is the entire city of Vale Ostrom and beyond, because the relay nodes of the old network extend far beyond the lower precincts, and because the frequency of the void cannot be contained by the suppression's architecture any more than the sun can be contained by a curtain. Calcinatio is the sacred burning. In the old alchemical tradition, the tradition that the Selvundran builders had encoded into every stone and carving and tonal relationship of Belsoreth, it was the first and in some ways most violent of the 7 operations. It burned away the accumulated material that was not genuinely the self. The defenses, the performances, the long-held postures of the professional life. The gray coat in the most precise sense. The obsidian buttons. The motto. It did not burn the self. It burned what was obscuring the self. What had been placed over the self by a world that preferred its people obscured. This is why the order feared it, not because it was destructive, because it was selective, because Belsoreth's sacred burning could not be turned against what was true. It had no effect whatsoever on what was genuinely, authentically, originally the nature of the person it encountered. It burned only what was false, and the suppressive order, its hierarchy, its authority, its entire apparatus of managing what the world was permitted to remember, was built entirely from false material. If you understand this, you understand everything. The order was not afraid of Belsoreth because it was powerful. The order was afraid of Belsoreth because it was true, and truth, brought into contact with falsehood, performs the calcinatio automatically, without intention, without malice, without any requirement beyond the contact itself. The way fire burns without trying. The way light illuminates without effort. The way the bell rings without mechanism, without maintenance, without anyone to sustain it. simply by being what it is. Tartaria sat in the sacred sublevels with Magi Savine, and the bell rang through the stones, and the last of the gray coat burned away in the sacred fog of his own interior calcinatio, and what remained, what was always there beneath it, what had always been there, waiting with the patience of deep crystal in the dark, began to be visible. It was the same thing that was always there, beneath every coat, in every person, in every body that had come within the veil's influence and breathed, even once, the alchemical smoke of Selvundra's sacred transformation. It was the original frequency, the prima vox, the first voice, the tone that the earth sings and that Belsoreth was built to amplify, and that every human body is, at its deepest level, designed to receive and carry and transmit. The frequency of what is irreducibly, indestructibly, permanently true. You cannot suppress it. You cannot manage it. You can build on top of it. You can bury the spires. You can rename the cathedral. You can send gray-coated professionals into the sacred fog to count the pilgrims and file the reports and maintain the comfortable numbness of the managed world. But the bell rings. It has always rung. And every palm pressed against every carved wall of Selvundra, in the sacred fog of the Vale of Ethmuin, receives its transmission, whether the receiving mind is ready to acknowledge it or not. The body knows. The body has always known. ## epilogue. The bell that never stopped. What happened to the man who had been Agent Tartarian? The records of the suppressive order do not say. His file was closed, annotated with the phrase operative withdrawal from active service, the order's designation for a number of situations, not all of them voluntary. His personal effects were catalogued and stored. His duties were redistributed. The restricted archive of the order's deepest holdings, the ones grown into the walls in the Selvundran manner, the ones that required the soul sight to read, that the order scholars catalogued without seeing because cataloging and seeing are not the same operation, said something different. It said, *subject completed first sacred operation. Residency established in sublevels. No further intervention indicated. The alchemical work has begun. In the lower precincts of Vale Ostrom, in the sacred fog of the Vale of Ethmuin that tasted of ancient copper and crystallized amber and the deep patient breath of the living earth, Oren still sat against the relay node wall on the evenings of the Vale months. He was harder to find than he had once been, not because he had moved, because those who came with closed hands could no longer perceive him at all, and those who came with open hands found him not with their eyes but with the warmth in their palms, the sudden intensification of the frequency that told them they were close, that they were in the field of the great transmitter, the first node, the one who had carried the sacred frequency of Selvundra through the entire duration of the suppression without once releasing it, without once contracting the vessel, without once ceasing the ancient and sacred work of the walkers in the fundamental. Magi Savine still received visitors 3 levels below the lowest street. The sublevel's cognitive labyrinth still worked on those who arrived with the closed hands of the managed world, turning them in gentle philosophical circles until they either opened or returned to the surface. Those who arrived with open hands, with the warmth in the palms that the veil granted to those who had breathed it long enough and honestly enough, found her without difficulty, found the chair, sat, heard the question. What did you come here knowing that you did not know you knew? And they answered, in the sacred darkness below Belsoreth, in the fundament, the ancient ones held the frequency in its most concentrated and essential form. Not sleeping, not dormant, holding, with the patience of deep crystal, with the patience of those who understand that the 7 operations of the alchemical self do not have a deadline, that the sacred burning cannot be rushed, that the coniunctio, the final unification, the gold, comes only when everything prior to it has been honestly and completely completed. The alchemical tradition of Selvundra had never promised speed. It had promised completion. And the bell rang. Selvundra was not gone. Selvundra was in the foundation, in the carved walls and the relay nodes and the veil of Ethmuin and the resonite shell of the void and the warmth in the palm and the loosening of the knot and the question that rises in the chest of every living being who presses their hand against something old and true and feels, for a moment, the transmission that has been waiting for them since before they were born. It was in the body that you are in right now, the body that is growing heavy and warm in the darkness, that is releasing its held tensions into the horizontal quiet, that is drifting toward the borderland between the waking world and the world below. That body knows Selvundra, has always known it, is at its deepest frequency made of it. Press your palm flat against whatever is beneath you now. The mattress, the pillow, the warm dark of the sleeping world. Feel the warmth that rises to meet you. That warmth is the calcinatio. That warmth is the sacred burning. That warmth is Bel-Soreth, which is not a cathedral in a buried city but the fundamental tone of existence itself, available in every moment to every being that stops managing long enough to receive it. You are receiving it now, in your palms, in the loosening of the jaw, the shoulders, the held breath, the long defended chest, in the place where the knot was, where something is slowly, warmly, irrevocably opening. Selvundra is not gone. Selvundra is the ground. Selvundra is the warmth in your hands. Selvundra is what you are. Breathe. Listen. The bell has never stopped. It is ringing now. In you. You already know the surface story. You know the sacred fog of the veil of Ethmuin, and the gray coat dissolving in it, and the carved walls that are not walls but the alchemical body of a living city. You know Orin, who sits in the amber patience of the ages and receives the fundamental tone. You know Magi Savine and her single sacred question and the sublevels that open only to open hands. You know Bel-Soreth, the void chamber, the Athenor, the sacred furnace at the heart of the buried cathedral, ringing without mechanism, ringing without maintenance, ringing with the tone of the earth's own irreducible nature. You know the calcinatio, the sacred burning, the first operation, the beginning of the seven. You know all of that, but there is something beneath even that. In Selvundra, the alchemical tradition speaks of 7 operations of the inner self, corresponding to 7 tones, corresponding to 7 levels of the sacred city's buried architecture, corresponding to 7 stages of a transformation so complete, so total, so alchemically thorough, that those who undergo it and survive it, the 43 known adepti of the Selvundran tradition, those who have reached the 7th and final operation of the Koniunksho, the great unification, are described in the old texts not as improved human beings but as something new, not superior, new, the way gold is new, not more than lead, not better than lead, transformed from lead, the same substance, different in its essential nature, changed by the fire into something that contains everything lead contained and nothing that lead could not release. The heroes of Selvundra were not heroes in the way the outer world uses the word. They were the adepti, the completed, and what completion meant, what it actually felt like from inside to stand in the 7th operation and receive the Koniunksho, the sacred unification, the marriage of the self with the frequency of the living earth, was something that could not be explained to those outside the process, could only be transmitted, body to body, stone to stone, bell to bone. This is the territory we enter now. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of what you know settle downward, out of the chest, out of the held space behind the eyes, down through the body and into the earth beneath you. You are not falling. You are being received. Go down. Hashtag chapter 1. The man who had begun to glow. It started with the hands. He noticed it 6 weeks after he stopped being Agent Tartarian and became simply the man who stayed, the man who had completed his calcinatio, his first burning, and had remained in the sublevels not because he could not leave but because the question of leaving had become, in the resonant dark below the lowest street, genuinely and peacefully irrelevant. He was not hiding. He was not lost. He was in precisely the right location, doing precisely the right thing, for the first time in 23 years of professional service that had been, in retrospect, a very elaborately constructed way of being in the wrong place. He had been sitting in the morning meditation, a practice Savine had given him with the same economy with which she gave everything. Sit here, palms down, do not seek the bell, let the bell find you. There is a difference. Learn the difference. The learning is the practice. And he had opened his eyes after some unmeasured duration and seen that his hands, flat on the resonite-infused stone floor of his small sublevel chamber, were very faintly luminescent. Not dramatically, not the bioluminescence of deep creatures in their cold abyssal world. More like the light that you see when you close your eyes and press your palms gently against the eyelids. That interior light, the light that is always already there, that the outer world is too bright to reveal. A warmth that came from inside the material of his hands rather than from any source outside them. He had looked at his hands for a long time, not with the professional gaze, not the assessing gaze of a man cataloging an anomaly, with the simple, astonished attention of a person seeing something true for the first time in a place they had looked many times before and seen nothing. His palms were warmer than the backs of his hands, and at the center of each palm, at the confluence of the hands' deep lines, the place the old sacred anatomy of Selvundra called the Porta Interiorum, the inner gate, there was a quality he had no adequate language for. A depth, not a hollow, not a depression in the flesh. A depth as if the palm at its center went further in than the physical hand could account for. As if there were a door there, and the door was beginning to open, and what was on the other side of the door was not another room but another order of reality entirely. He showed Savine the next morning. She looked at his palms with the focused softness that was her mode of sacred attention. Not the analytical looking of the professional world, but the seer's looking, the Selvundran tradition's specific cultivation of perception that receives rather than extracts, that allows rather than demands. "How long?" she said. "I noticed 6 weeks ago. I believe it began earlier. It began the night you pressed your palm against the relay node wall," she said. "The calcinatio opened the first channel that night. I have been observing its development since you arrived. He absorbed this. You did not tell me. The seed does not benefit from being told it is becoming a tree," she said. "It knows. It has always known. What it needs is not information but conditions. Dark, warmth, depth, the continued presence of the sacred frequency in the earth beneath it, doing what the sacred frequency does in every available vessel that ceases, even briefly, to resist it. She set her instrument down and regarded him with her dark, geological eyes. "You are entering the solutio," she said, "the second sacred operation." He knew the word. He had studied the alchemical tradition in the restricted archive, studied it with the order's prescribed interpretive lens as pre-scientific mythology, but he had studied it, and the word carried its full weight. Solutio, the dissolving, the second operation, she said, is water where the first was fire. The calcinatio burned away the false material, the gray coat, the professional distance, the 23 years of managed numbness. The solutio dissolves what remains of the structures built to hold that material in place. The internal architecture of the suppression. The walls inside the self that corresponded to the walls the order built around Belsoreth. She paused. "You will find, in the weeks ahead, that things you held with great rigidity begin to soften. Certainties, self-definitions, the hard edges of what you believed yourself to be." "That sounds," he began. "Frightening," she said. "Yes, the order calls it breakdown. The tradition calls it the sacred dissolution. The difference is not in the experience but in what you believe about its purpose. The order believes the dissolution is a loss. The tradition knows it is a preparation." He looked at his glowing palms. "Preparation for what?" he said. "For the third operation," she said. "The coagulatio, the resolidifying, what you are at your deepest truth, reconstituted in a new and truer form, without the false structure, without the knot." She let that settle. "But we cannot arrive at the third before completing the second. The solutio cannot be hurried. It takes the time it takes, and the only mistake available to you is resistance." He placed his palms flat on the table. The depth at their centers pulsed very gently, like a breath, like the bell. "Then I will not resist," he said, and he meant it. Chapter 2. Oren speaks of the 7 operations. There was a morning, marked not by light but by the bell's subtle shift of tone at what would have been dawn, a fraction of a deepening perceptible only to those who had lived long enough in the sublevels to learn to feel it in the waking of their bodies, the first sensation of consciousness as a kind of resonance rather than a kind of alarm. There was such a morning when Oren's voice came through the south wall of Tartaria's chamber differently. Not louder, not closer exactly, though closer was the closest word. It was as if the stone between them had, overnight, become more permeable. As if the solutio that was dissolving the rigid interior architecture of the man in the chamber was also dissolving, slightly, the boundary between the chamber and the great warm presence on the other side of the stone. As if dissolution, once begun, worked in all directions simultaneously. "You are ready," Oren said. His voice was the voice of something very old speaking from a place of very great warmth, the way the deepest stratum of the earth is warm, not with the warmth of sun, which is the warmth of the surface, the warmth of what is exposed and temporary, but with the warmth of what has been held internally for so long that the holding has become a kind of heat. To hear what I am, Orin said, and what you are, and what the 7 operations in their completion make of both. He spoke slowly, in the cadence of the earth itself, not narrative time, not the sequential unfolding of one thing after another, but geological time, the time of the deep patient formation of things, the time of crystal growing in absolute dark from the slow accretion of what the earth provides. He said, in the sacred tradition of Selvundra, in the tradition that is not separate from the city's alchemical architecture but is the same tradition expressed in different material, the way the tone of Belsorith and the inscription membrane of the Magi and the body of the giant are all the same tradition expressed in different vessels. In this tradition, the human being is understood as a microcosm, not as metaphor, as precision. The human body is, in its physical architecture, a replica of the cosmological architecture. The 7 sacred operations of the interior self correspond to the 7 tones of Belsorith, which correspond to the 7 telluric channels beneath Veilostrum, which correspond to the 7 levels of the buried city's sacred infrastructure, which correspond to the 7 metals of the old alchemists, which correspond to the 7 celestial bodies that the Selvundran tradition called the 7 governors of the living world. Everything in sevens. Not because 7 was a favored number, because the sacred architecture of existence has 7 primary movements, and the tradition of Selvundra had spent millennia charting them and had built their entire civilization, their technology, their architecture, their sacred practice, their social structure, their relationship with the living earth beneath them, around the precise and reverential working with of those 7 movements. The giants, Orin said, were the living embodiment of this cosmological understanding. They had been made, or had evolved, or had been initiated into being. The tradition used all 3 descriptions without contradiction because in Selvundra these were not different processes, at the intersection of the human and the cosmological. They were, in their bodies, what Belsorith was in stone and crystal and resonite and the sacred void at its center. Vessels of the fundamental frequency, calibrated to carry and transmit the tone of the living earth without loss, without distortion, without the attenuation that ordinary human bodies suffer from the noise of the surface world. But they were not separate from the human. This was the first and most important thing the Order had deliberately misrepresented about them. The giants were not a different species, not a separate lineage, not the products of a different origin. They were, in the Selvundran understanding, the furthest expression of what all human beings were moving toward through the 7 operations, through the alchemical work of the interior self, through the long sacred patience of the Via Alchemica. They were, in the most precise sense, what the Conjunction produces, what the 7th and final operation, the sacred unification, makes of the human vessel when it has been completely, honestly, thoroughly transformed. The Adepti became giants, not in body, not in the literal sense of the 11 to 13 feet that Orin expressed in his ancient and beautiful physical form. but in the frequency sense, in the capacity to carry and transmit the fundamental tone, in the openness of the vessel, in the quality of permeability to the sacred resonance of the living earth that the old texts called the amplitude of the fully completed self. "You are telling me," Tartarian said slowly, from his place against the warm stone of the south wall, his palms resting open on his knees in the posture of sacred receptivity, that the 7 operations do not merely change us, they expand us. "They do not expand," Oren said. "They reveal." The amplitude was always present. The prima vox, the first voice, the fundamental tone. It is in every human being in its complete and perfect form, from the beginning. The operations do not add to it. They remove what obscures it. The gray coat, the knot, the walls inside the self that the surface world builds and calls civilization and calls identity and calls the professional self. A pause, warm and spacious as a summer evening. When those are removed, when the calcinatio has burned and the solutio has dissolved and the coagulatio has rebuilt and all the operations have done their patient sacred work, what remains is the full amplitude, the original frequency, unobscured, and the body vibrating at the full amplitude is, like you, Tartarian said, like Bel-Soreth, Oren said. "I am Bel-Soreth in a different vessel, as you will be, as the Magi already is, as every being that completes the 7 operations becomes, in their own particular and unrepeatable form, a living expression of the fundamental tone. A node in the sacred network of everything that is true and alive and resonant in the world." The tone moved through the stones around them. Tartarian sat with this for a long time. Then he said, "And the suppression, the order, the managed flooding and the buried spires were an attempt," Oren said, with the equanimity of something that has observed the attempt for 2 centuries and watched it fail with absolute consistency, "to prevent the completion of the 7 operations, to maintain the world in the calcinatio stage, in the burning, without allowing it to proceed to the solutio and beyond, to keep the knot tight, to keep the gray coat on, to ensure that the amplitude of the human self remained permanently obscured." "Why?" Tartarian said. "What do they fear from the completed self? What does the night fear from the dawn?" Oren said simply and without drama, "Nothing. The night does not fear the dawn. But the night ends when the dawn comes. The order does not fear us. The order fears its own ending. And it is right to. When the operations are complete, when the network is alive, when the transmitters are transmitting, when Bel-Soreth sings at its full amplitude into a city of open-handed, open-palmed, solutio-softened human beings, the structures built from false material dissolve. Not violently, not through conflict, through the simple, irresistible operation of the alchemical truth. Calcinatio, Tartarian said. "The order itself," Oren said gently, "is subject to the same sacred operations as everything else. The fire is not selective about what it burns. It burns what is not true. It always has. It always will. The bell deepened in the stones, and the man who had been Agent Tartarian sat in the sacred warmth of the solutio with his open palms and his dissolving walls and his glowing hands, and understood, with the slow and luminous clarity of something becoming what it has always been, that the alchemical work of Selvundra was not contained within the lower precincts of Vale Ostrom. It was the nature of existence itself, and it had never, not for one moment, stopped. ## Chapter 3. The Rite of the Sacred Opening. Magi Savine came to his chamber on the 33rd day of the solutio. She did not knock. Knocking is the convention of the surface world, the world of solid walls and managed access and the professional distance maintained between one body and another. The sublevels did not operate by surface convention. Thresholds in the sacred architecture of Selvundra were not barriers but invitations, permeable membranes rather than locked doors, responsive to the quality of what approached them rather than to any mechanism of permission. She stood at the threshold for a moment. He felt her standing there before he was aware of her with any conventional sense. This was new. This was the solutio at work in him, the dissolving of the rigid boundaries between the inside and the outside of the self, the gradual softening of the division between what was perceived and what was felt, what was known intellectually and what was known in the body. The professional self had maintained absolute clarity about this division. The professional self had been very clear that information came through the sanctioned channels, the eyes, the ears, the instruments and documents of the order, and not through the body's own deeper senses, which the order's training had systematically closed the way you close a window against weather. The solutio was opening the windows. He felt Savine standing at his threshold and turned to face her, and she came in and sat across from him, and she looked at him with her deep dark eyes for a moment in silence, and then she said, "You are ready for the transmission. Tell me what it is," he said. "It cannot be told," she said, "only given. This is the nature of the sacred tradition of Selvundra. The 7 operations cannot be described from outside and understood. They can only be transmitted from one completed vessel to an opening one, body to body, frequency to frequency, in the direct alchemical contact that the tradition calls the impartation." She paused. "I am going to give you the sublimatio," she said, "the 4th sacred operation, the rising." He understood the word from the restricted archive. Sublimatio, the operation of elevation, of taking what has been burned and dissolved and reformed in the first 3 operations and lifting it, literally lifting the refined substance of the transformed self into a higher register of being. In the physical alchemical tradition, the sublimatio was the operation of evaporation, of turning the purified liquid residue of the first 3 operations into vapor, into something that could rise, that could move upward through the vessel into spaces the original material could never have reached. In the inner alchemical tradition of Selvundra, the tradition of the self, the tradition that Bel-Soreth was built to support and Savine was built to transmit, the sublimatio was the opening of what she had called, in their earlier conversations, the 2nd channel, the generative channel, the channel that did not receive the fundamental frequency but emitted it. "How?" he said. She looked at him with absolute steadiness. "You have been sitting in the solutio for 33 days, she said. "You have allowed the dissolution to do its work. You have not resisted the softening, the opening of the windows, the dissolving of the walls between inside and outside, between the body's knowledge and the mind's permission. This is rare. Most who reach this stage resist the solutio, resist the dissolution of the rigid self because the rigid self is what they know and its dissolution feels like loss." She tilted her head. "How did it feel?" "Like relief," he said, after a pause. "Like putting down something very heavy, and then being surprised at how far I had forgotten I was carrying it." She nodded. "That is the correct experience of the solutio. And it tells me the vessel is prepared. The walls are down. The channels are open. The false material has dissolved and what remains is clear." She placed her palms flat on the floor beside her, in the posture of sacred earth contact. "Now we do the sublimatio. Tell me what to do," he said. "Nothing," she said. This was the instruction she always gave, the instruction that was always the hardest, the instruction that required the most of those who had spent their lives in the managed world of professional doing. "Do not try. Do not reach. Do not use any skill that the surface world has given you, not observation, not analysis, not the disciplined management of anything. Let those rest. They have done what they could. They brought you here. They served their purpose and they are done." He closed his eyes. "The bell knows what it is doing," Savine said, and her voice was very soft and very near and simultaneously very ancient. The voice of a tradition speaking through a particular woman's throat. "Bel Soreth has been preparing for this moment since before you were born. The network of the city has been transmitting toward you since the first morning of the first veil season when you were still in the middle city and the sacred fog reached the cracks in your window and found, in the first breath of your sleeping body, the original frequency waiting to be found. The calcinatio began then. Everything since has been preparation. Everything since has been the patient, sacred, necessary preparation of the vessel. The bell moved through the stones, through the floor, through his crossed legs, up his spine, through the dissolved space in his chest, through the open windows of his softened perception, through the porta interiorum, the inner gate at the center of each palm. "Trust the bell," she said. "Trust the stone. Trust the warmth." He trusted. He released the last thing he was holding. He did not know what the last thing was until he released it. It was not a belief or a habit or a professional posture. It was something simpler and more essential than any of those. It was the last thread of the conviction that he was separate, that the space between his skin and the stone of the sublevels was a meaningful barrier, that the edge of the self was the skin. He released it, and the sacred frequency of Bel Soreth, which had been moving through the stone and through his bones and through the open channels of his dissolving interior for 33 days, found the open vessel, found the cleared and prepared and waiting interior, found the space where the false material had been and where now there was only the original frequency, only the prima vox, only the fundamental tone of what he actually irreducibly, unchangeably was, and moved upward through the vessel into a new register, the sublimatio, the rising. What he felt was not a feeling that belonged to the vocabulary of the surface world. Not joy exactly, though it contained everything joy was made of. Not power, though the old alchemical texts used the word virtus, the sacred strength, to describe what the fourth operation deposits in the vessel. Not expansion, though the sense of internal spaciousness was so complete and so sudden that he gasped, and the gasp turned into something that was not quite laughter and not quite weeping, but was the sound the body makes when it discovers that it is enormously, fundamentally, inescapably larger than it had been told. He opened his eyes. His hands were not faintly luminescent. They were lit from the inside, from the porta interiorum, from the inner gate at the center of each palm, a warm and clear and living light, the same frequency light that lived in the walls of the sublevels, that lived in the Vale of Ethmuin. That was the visible expression of Bel-Sorith's sacred tone made photonic, made visible, made available to ordinary perception. That light, in his hands, in his body, moving from the hands up the wrists and arms with the steady, unhurried pace of a tide. Magi Savine watched. Her face was still. Her eyes were full. "There it is," she said very quietly, to herself or to the sacred tradition or to the bell or to all three at once. There it always is. Chapter 4. The 7 operations and the nature of the ancient power. It is necessary now to speak plainly of what the completed self can do. Not in the vocabulary of the surface world's understanding of power, which is a vocabulary of domination and force and the management of one thing by another thing. In the vocabulary of the Selvundran sacred tradition, which has a different understanding of power entirely, an understanding so different that the surface world's word barely applies, and the tradition typically used a different word, virtus, sacred strength. The strength of the thing that has been completed, the strength of gold. The first thing the virtus does is perceive, not with the ordinary senses, though those sharpen considerably in the completed vessel. The tradition's accounts of the adepti consistently describe an intensification of the physical senses that borders on the uncomfortable, the way bright light is uncomfortable to eyes adjusted to the dark. The virtus perceives at the frequency level. The completed self feels truth the way the hand feels warmth, directly, physically, without interpretation, without the possibility of mistaking it for something else. A lie, felt by the completed self, has a frequency signature as unmistakable as a false note in a chord. It produces a specific sensation, not pain, not disgust, but the simple, immediate physical awareness of dissonance, of something vibrating at a frequency that does not align with the fundamental tone. The way Bel-Sorith's countertone devices had produced dissonance rather than silence, because you cannot silence truth, you can only introduce noise, and noise has a different frequency signature than the original tone, and the completed self can hear the difference. This is what the order truly fears. Not power in the domination sense, not an army of giants, not a revolution, The Adepti are not warriors, and the sacred tradition of Selvundra has never produced warriors, because warfare requires a dualistic understanding of the world. Us and them, the sacred and the profane, the truth and the enemy of truth. And the alchemical tradition's deepest teaching is that duality is the surface appearance of unity, that the division between the sacred and the profane is itself the material burned in the calcinatio, that the completed self does not stand against the false world but dissolves it, as the sun dissolves fog, not through opposition but through presence. What the order fears is presence. The completed self, standing in any space, performing the sublimatio, the rising of the sacred frequency from its own interior, fills that space with the alchemical tone the way Belsoreth fills the lower precincts with it. And everything in that space that is made of false material begins, automatically, inevitably, without any intention on the part of the completed self, to undergo its own calcinatio, its own burning. The structures built from fear begin to soften in the presence of the completed self, the way the ice on a spring morning softens when the sun arrives, not through any act of will by the sun, not through any force or intention, but through the simple and inviolable fact of the sun's nature. The completed self shines, and what is not true cannot survive the shining. The second thing the Virtus does is heal. Again, not in the surface world sense, not the medical intervention and biological process, though the tradition does report remarkable physical effects in those who have prolonged contact with the Adepti. In the alchemical sense, the completed self in contact with the knotted self transmits the frequency that the knotted self has been starved of, and the knot releases. Not because the completed self forces it, because the knotted self recognizes the frequency, recognizes it in the way you recognize a beloved voice in a crowd, immediately, completely, without analysis, and the recognition is itself the releasing. This was what happened when the people of the lower precincts brought Oren bread on cold evenings, and he thanked them, and they went home different. Not healed of any specific thing, not changed in any catalogable way, simply slightly more true than they had been, slightly more themselves. The knot in each of them slightly looser by the proximity of the one in whom the knot was entirely gone. The third thing the Virtus does, and this is the thing the tradition speaks of most carefully, in the language that is most guarded, that is given only to those who have completed at least the first 4 operations and have some experiential understanding of what they are receiving. The third thing is transmutation. The completed self can initiate the calcinatio in others, not impose it. The sacred tradition is extremely clear on this distinction and its importance. The alchemical operations cannot be done to a person. They can only be done by a person with their own essential participation, their own opening of the hands, their own release of the final thing they are holding. What the completed self can do is be present in a way that makes the calcinatio more available, more perceivable, more accessible, more felt to those who are ready for it. Like Belsoreth. Belsoreth does not force the sacred burning on anyone. It simply rings. And those who enter its field and are ready, those who have some looseness in the knot already, some crack in the gray coat, some moment of pressing their hand against the right wall at the right time and feeling however briefly, the transmission that the wall has always been carrying. Those people find, in the presence of Bel-Soreth, that the readiness becomes action. The calcinatio begins. The Adepti are human Bel-Soreths, living cathedrals, walking sacred furnaces. This is what Selvundra built them to be. This is what the 7 operations make. This is what every human being, given the right conditions, given the sacred fog of the veil, given the question of the Magi, given the patience of the giant, given the tone of the bell available through the relay nodes of the ancient network, is moving toward. What you are made of, what you have always been moving toward. Hashtag chapter 5. Orin stands. It happened on the 47th day of the sublimatio. Orin stood up. This is a simple sentence for an event that was not simple. Orin standing was not merely a physical event, though it was that. The slow and glacial rising of 13 feet of sacred presence from the posture of the patient receiving into the posture of the active transmission. A movement that took a long time and involved the repositioning of a great deal of ancient and concentrated sacred material, like the slow unfolding of something that has been held in the seed position for a very long time and is at last, putting forth its first upward movement toward the light. It was a sacred event. It was the event that the Selvundran tradition had called, in its most restricted and carefully held accounts, the ones that Savine had spent 40 years reconstructing, the resurgence of the first transmitter. The moment when the oldest node of the sacred network moved from receptive to generative mode. The moment that, in the cosmological understanding of Selvundra, corresponded not to a human-scale event but to a universal one. The moment in the cycle of all cycles when the pendulum reverses its direction, when the in-breath becomes the out-breath, when the gathering becomes the giving, when the long sacred patience of the holding transforms into the long sacred power of the release. Orin stood, and the frequency that he had held in his ancient body through 2 centuries of the suppression, held with the perfect and unbroken consistency of something that understood that the holding was the work, that the waiting was the sacred act, that the patience itself was the transmission, the long continuous message sent into the stones of Vale Ostrom and the Vale of Ethmuin and the bodies of every being who had lived in proximity to the lower precincts and felt, however briefly, however confusedly, the warmth in the palms and the loosening of the knot and the question arising in the chest that did not yet have words. That frequency, held for 2 centuries in the vessel of the largest and most ancient of the Selvundran transmitters, was released. Not explosively, not dramatically, the way the sun rises, the way Bel-Soreth's tone moves through stone. Slowly, completely, in all directions simultaneously, with a thoroughness that has no edges and no exceptions. Tartarian was in the passage when it happened. He had been walking, not for any purpose, simply walking, which was something the sublimatio had made necessary. The second channel, now open, now transmitting, generated a frequency that needed to move through his body the way a river needs to move through its course. And when he remained stationary for too long, the frequency built in him with a gentle but insistent pressure that was not uncomfortable but was unmistakably motion seeking to happen, so he walked. He moved through the sublevels and the lower precinct passages and the carved acoustic channels, and wherever he walked the relay nodes brightened very slightly. The veil thickened with a fractionally more luminescent quality. The carved walls spoke their ancient tonal language with a slightly more audible frequency. He was walking when the passage filled with light, not from any source, not from above, not from the relay nodes, not from his own lit hands. From everywhere simultaneously, the alchemical light of the resurgence, the light of the first transmitter coming to full generative power, moving through the stone network of Selvundra the way current moves through an old circuit that has finally found its source again. He stopped. He looked toward the relay node wall. Orin was standing, 13 feet of ancient sacred presence, fully upright, one great hand pressed palm out against the relay node wall, the frequency pouring from him in the visible way, the shimmering clarity that made the usually invisible acoustic geometry of the carved walls suddenly, completely legible, the resonance lines between the buildings lit from within, the network of Selvundra alive in its full dimension for the first time in 200 years. Tartarian raised his own hands, palms out. The second channel opened to its full amplitude, and where the frequency of the first transmitter met the frequency of the newly sublimatio open vessel, where the ancient and the newly completed met in the carved passage of the lower precincts, in the sacred fog of the Vale of Ethmuin, in the alchemical body of the living city, a harmonic formed. A new tone, not Belsorith's tone, not Orin's tone, not Tartarian's tone, chord, the chord of the completed network. Two nodes transmitting simultaneously, their frequencies combining the way the frequencies of the seven spires had combined in the age of Selvundra's full expression, into something that was greater than either, not through addition but through the sacred alchemy of harmonic combination, the way two musical tones together create not two sounds but a third, a tone that did not exist in either alone, a tone that could only exist in the relationship. The wall sang, the passage sang, the veil sang, and in the deep sacred dark below Belsorith, in the fundament where the ancient ones had held the concentrated frequency through the long duration of the suppression, the beings who were not sleeping felt the chord and recognized it and began, for the first time in 200 years, to move upward. Not quickly. Nothing in Selvundra is quick, but rising, the way Belsorith had always been rising, the way the truth has always been rising. ## Chapter 6. The Magi completes the record. In her chamber, 3 levels below the lowest street, Magi Savine sat at her table and pressed her palms flat on the inscription membrane. She had been waiting for this moment for 40 years. Not passively. The Selvundran tradition did not produce passive waiters. The long years of the solutio and the coagulatio and the sublimatio and the 3 operations beyond it that she had completed in her own long sacred journey burned away passivity along with everything else that was not essential. She had been active in her waiting the way the deep earth is active in its apparent stillness, the way the void at the center of Belsorith is active in its apparent emptiness, doing the work that only stillness can do, holding what only stillness can hold, being available in the specific and irreplaceable way that only the truly stilled self is available to receive. She had been reconstructing the inscription membrane for 40 years. 40 years of gathering fragments and ruins and the somatic memories of pilgrims who arrived carrying in their bodies things they did not know they were carrying. 40 years of reading the alchemical architecture of the city itself. Reading the carvings not as the order read them, seeking information, but as a musician reads a score, seeking the living music that the notation points toward. 40 years of the Koniunctio, the seventh sacred operation, the great unification, the operation in which the completed self and the sacred tradition and the living earth and the tone of Bel-Soreth and the memory of Selvundra are unified in a single living act of knowing that is not merely intellectual but somatic, alchemical, total. The inscription membrane shimmered beneath her hands. The cord of the two transmitters moved through the stone and into the table and into the membrane and into her hands, and the membrane responded the way it always responded to the sacred frequency, the way the inscription always came clearer in the bell's presence, the way the deep text that was grown into the material rather than written on its surface became more legible, more present, more fully what it had always been but could only show itself in the alchemical conditions of sufficient resonance. She read what she had always known but had never seen complete before this moment. The full account of Selvundra, not the history. The Order's historians could write the history and had gotten most of the factual sequence approximately right, even as they had gotten everything that mattered entirely wrong. Not the chronicle of events, the account of the frequency, the account of what Selvundra had been at the level beneath events, beneath history, beneath the external record of what was built and when and by whom and with what materials. The account of Selvundra as a living alchemical process. A civilization that had structured itself entirely around the sacred operation of transformation. The transformation not of metals but of consciousness, not of lead into gold but of the sleeping self into the completed self, the adeptus, the one who had undergone all 7 operations and emerged on the other side not as an improved version of the original but as something of an entirely different order, and had built its technology, its sacred architecture, its resonance networks, its frequency engineering, its cathedrals, not to make life easier or more comfortable or more efficient in the way the surface world understood those words, but to make the 7 operations more available, more accessible, more present in the daily life of ordinary people who were not mystics, not scholars, not seekers in any dramatic sense, but simply people who lived in Selvundra and breathed the veil and pressed their hands against the walls and felt the warmth and were changed by it, slowly over their lifetimes, in ways that did not have the vocabulary of the sacred tradition but had the reality of it. The account of how the suppression had come, not in the terms the Order's restricted archive used, not the language of resource control and information management and the deliberate dismantling of technological infrastructure considered dangerous. In the sacred tradition's terms, the language of the counter-alchemical, of a force that understood, with precision and deliberateness, what the alchemical tradition was doing and what it would produce if allowed to continue, a world of open-handed, second-channel active, sublimatio-risen human beings, a network of the completed, a city of living Bel-Soreths, an entire civilization operating at the amplitude of the fully transmuted self, and had intervened systematically to prevent it, not because it feared the power, because it feared the freedom. The completed self is not controllable. not because it is rebellious or difficult or oppositional, because it perceives truth at the frequency level, and the management of human beings requires the management of truth, the careful administration of what is known and what is not known, what is permitted to be felt and what is suppressed, what is real and what is permitted to be named, and a world of beings who feel truth directly in the body before the mind can be instructed to doubt it, is a world in which that management is simply not possible. The suppression was not a political event. It was an alchemical one, an attempt to freeze the sacred process in the calcinatio stage, to keep the burning burning without allowing the dissolution, to maintain the world in the fire without allowing the water, without allowing the softening and the opening and the dissolution of the rigid walls of the managed self that the solutio brings, without allowing the coagulatio and the sublimatio and the mortificatio and the separatio and the final great coniunctio, to maintain the world in the first pain, forever, and call that pain the natural and permanent condition of the human being. She read this. She had always known it, but she had never seen it complete before. She pressed her palms harder on the membrane. The inscription blazed, not dangerously, not blindingly, but with the specific and steady luminescence of something that has been waiting 40 years to be fully itself, that has been reaching toward completion through all the patient decades of the reconstruction, that is now, in the frequency of the chord of the two transmitters and the rising of the ancient ones from the fundament and the bell singing at its highest amplitude in 2 centuries. Complete. The membrane was complete. The account was complete. Savine sat for a long moment in the completeness. Then, very quietly, without ceremony, without drama, in the private alchemical interior of the woman who had spent 40 years holding the thread while others found their way back, she wept. Not with grief, with the specific quality of release that belongs to the coniunctio, the 7th sacred operation, the great unification, the moment when the long work of the completed self meets the long work of the sacred tradition and recognizes itself in it. And the recognition is so complete and so total that the body can do nothing with it but open, entirely, in the most honest expression available to it, which is tears. This is what we have always been, she thought or felt or knew without the mediation of thought at all. This is Selvundra, *, not the city, not the architecture, not the network or the cathedral or the inscription membrane or the sacred tradition. *, Selvundra is this completion, this recognition, this weeping that is not weeping but the 7th operation. This is what they suppressed. This is what could not be suppressed. This is what the bell has been ringing toward through all the long years of the forgetting. This #epilogue. The rising. What happened next in the outer world, in the Order's monitoring stations and the restricted archive and the carefully maintained apparatus of the suppression, is less important than what happened in the inner world. And what happened in the inner world was this. The network lived. The 2 transmitters transmitted, and their cord moved through the relay nodes of the ancient frequency network of Selvundra. and the relay nodes carried it through the stone layers of the city the way the deep telluric channels carry the sacred current of the living earth, without loss, without attenuation, through every material, through every barrier, through all the layers of rebuilding and renaming and the suppression's patient architectural work of forgetting, because the frequency of Selvundra does not require permission to move through the material of Selvundra any more than water requires the rock's permission to flow through it. The network lived, and everything the network touched was offered the calcinatio. Not forced, not imposed, offered in the way that Bel-Soreth has always offered it, through presence, through the simple and irresistible fact of a frequency that the human body recognizes at its deepest level as the frequency of home, of origin, of what was before the gray coat and the obsidian buttons and the professional distance and the not and the long managed sleep of the managed world. And people responded. In the lower precincts and the middle city and the high towers of the upper city, in the Order's own administrative buildings and monitoring stations and sub-basement archive rooms, in every space the network reached, in every body that breathed the now more luminous veil of Ethmuin, people felt the warmth in their palms. Some of them turned their palms over and looked at them in surprise. Some of them pressed their hands flat against walls they had passed 1,000 times and felt, for the first time, the wall press back. Some of them felt, in the place where the knot was, a very slight but unmistakable loosening. What is that? They thought, in the private language of the body's own sacred knowledge, in the language that precedes words and has no need of them. What is that warmth? What is that tone? What is that? Oh, I have felt this before. I have always felt this. I simply forgot. Oren walked through the lower precincts of Vale Ostrom, and the relay nodes lit in his wake, and the people came to their windows and their doorways and looked at him with the particular expression of those who are in the early stages of the calcinatio. Not yet knowing what they are feeling, but knowing that what they are feeling is important, that it requires attention, that the professional self's instruction to categorize and dismiss it is less compelling than it has ever been. They looked at Oren. Oren looked back. He did not speak. He did not need to. What he was transmitting was not words. And in the sacred dark of the fundament, below Bel-Soreth, below 11 layers of the buried living city of Selvundra, the ancient ones continued to rise. Slowly, with the patience of things that have been still for 2 centuries and are not rushing now, because rushing is the surface world's relationship with time, and they have a different relationship. The relationship of those who know that all of time is the same water and that what is rising has always been rising and will arrive, without question, without doubt, without any possibility of being stopped by the suppression or the order or any force that has ever been assembled in the managed world. Because the managed world sits on the fundament, and the fundament is alive. And the bell is ringing, and Selvundra is not gone. Selvundra is the ground you are lying on right now, the sacred foundation of the sleeping world. Feel it beneath you. Feel the warmth rising through it, from the deep and patient earth, from the alchemical dark where the ancient ones move upward through the layers of the buried city. from the fundament where the concentrated sacred frequency has been held in perfect stillness through all the long years of the forgetting, rising into the stone, into the walls, into the veil that is the sacred fog of the breath of the transformation, into the air, into your lungs, into your blood, into the porta interiorum, the inner gate at the center of each palm, into the place where the knot was, which is looser tonight than it has ever been, which is releasing now in the sacred dark of the sleeping body, in the alchemical night that is the mortificatio, the fifth sacred operation, the sacred dying of the day self, the nightly dissolution of the surface world's constructions, which is releasing, softening, opening, with the warm and unhurried and completely trustworthy patience of a process that has been working in you since before you knew it was working. The calcinatio, the burning, has begun. Let it burn. What it burns is not you. What it burns was never you. What remains when the burning is complete is what you have always been beneath the coat, beneath the professional distance, beneath the knot, beneath the long and patient sleep of a world that forgot what it was made of. Gold, original, fundamental, ringing. Selvundra is not gone. Selvundra is the ground. Selvundra is what you are. And the bell is ringing now. In you, in you, in you. Sleep, and while you sleep, the sacred work continues. It has never stopped. It will never stop. The 7 operations require only one thing from you: your willingness to be completed. You are willing. You have always been willing. That is why you are here. That is why you listened. That is why the bell called, and why you heard it. Sleep. The bell is ringing. Listen.